It all began on a day that seemed ordinary, yet it carried within it a story that would echo far beyond the streets of Ouagadougou. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, motorbikes weaving through narrow lanes, women balancing baskets of fruit on their heads, children chasing each other in laughter, and vendors calling out the price of mangoes, peanuts, and roasted maize. Life in Burkina Faso, like much of Africa, has its share of hardship, but also an undeniable spirit of resilience. And in that mixture of survival and hope, something unforgettable was about to happen. President Ibrahim Traoré was not just another leader hidden away in palaces or shielded behind tinted windows. To many people, he was a symbol, a man who chose to stand with his people rather than above them. But leadership, especially of a nation burdened by poverty, threats, and instability, often demanded long hours, tough decisions, and moments of deep solitude. Still, on that day, as his convoy moved slowly through a crowded neighborhood, fate placed him face to face with a story that would break even the hardest of hearts. The sound came first, a knock, not the kind that startles, but one that carried hesitation, uncertainty, and desperation all at once. Tap, tap, tap against the car window. It wasn't the booming knock of a soldier or the firm call of an aide. It was softer, almost timid, the kind of knock you might hear from someone unsure if they even deserve to be heard. And when President Traoré turned his eyes, he saw him, a boy, no older than 10, his clothes worn thin, his face smudged with dust, and his eyes, those eyes, carried a story too heavy for a child to bear.
This was no ordinary child. This was an orphan. And in that moment, the world outside the car seemed to blur, as if the bustling city had suddenly gone silent. The boy pressed his tiny hand against the window, clutching something close to his chest. He didn't speak at first. Maybe he didn't know what to say. Maybe words had failed him long before this day. But the message in his eyes was clear. Hunger, loss, longing. A cry for help that needed no translation. Inside the car, the atmosphere shifted. The soldiers in the front seat instinctively stiffened, their training demanding alertness at every unusual interaction. But Traoré wasn't just a commander. He was a son of the soil, a man who understood the struggle of children like this one. Slowly, he signaled for the car to halt. The convoy paused, and that small decision, almost unnoticeable at first, would set into motion a story that thousands would later whisper about. The boy's lips trembled as if battling the weight of words too painful to release. Finally, with a voice barely above a whisper, he asked for something simple: food. Not money, not favors, not promises of wealth. Just food. Something to ease the hunger that had gnawed at his stomach for days. In a world where so many ask leaders for power or position, here was a child asking only for survival. Contrast that for a moment. Outside the car window stood a boy who owned nothing but his courage to knock, while inside sat the most powerful man in the nation. Yet, in that instant, power melted away, and what remained was human to human, heart to heart. The gulf between a president and an orphan collapsed into something raw and profoundly simple: empathy. Without hesitation, Traoré lowered the window. The crowd nearby murmured, surprised at the president's willingness to engage so directly. The boy stepped back slightly, unsure, but Traoré leaned forward, his eyes meeting the child's with a softness that was rarely seen in politics. He asked the boy his name, and then, gently, he asked about his parents. The answer cut through the air like a knife. They were gone, both taken, victims of a reality that so many African children know too well. Conflict, disease, poverty, whatever the reason, this child had been left alone in a world that often forgets the most vulnerable. For a moment, even the soldiers turned their eyes away, as if the weight of the boy's pain was too much to bear. And yet, the boy did not cry. His face carried a maturity that no child should ever have. That, perhaps, was the most heartbreaking detail. He had learned to endure sorrow in silence. President Traoré slowly stepped out of the car. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder now. It is not every day that a head of state halts his journey to speak with an orphan. But Traoré was not moved by appearances or protocol. He was moved by humanity. As he approached the boy, He extended his hand, not as a president towering over a child, but as a man acknowledging another soul. The boy placed his small hand in Traore's palm, and in that touch was an unspoken promise. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. This was more than charity. This was symbolism. A leader whose time could have been consumed by meetings, strategies, or politics instead chose to kneel down and listen. And as he did, the cameras caught a moment that would ripple across the nation. The boy was given food, yes, but he was also given something far greater: dignity. Stories like these travel faster than fire in the savannah. By the next day, people across Burkina Faso were talking. Some with tears, others with pride. To them, this was not just about one boy. It was about what leadership means in its truest form. It was about a vision of Africa where the powerful do not ignore the powerless, where the cries of orphans are not silenced but answered. And yet, for every child like him, there are countless others whose knocks go unheard. That contrast, one boy touched by hope, many others still waiting, is what makes this story both inspiring and haunting. It reminds us of what could be and of what still needs to be done. But let us not rush the ending. For this encounter between the orphan and the president was not just a fleeting act of kindness. It was a moment layered with meaning, with lessons, and with questions that demand answers. How should a leader carry the burdens of his people? What happens when humanity collides with power? And what can one story, one act, spark in the hearts of millions? As the boy ate, shielded by the president himself, the onlookers saw more than just food being shared. They saw a possibility that leadership could be tender, that politics could be human, that Africa's future could be rewritten not only by policies but by compassion. This was only the beginning of the story, for what unfolded after would reveal even more about the heart of a leader and the resilience of a child. And as we dive deeper, you will see why this single knock on a window became a knock on the conscience of an entire nation. The air around the scene carried a weight that could not be described easily. Onlookers whispered among themselves, unsure whether to cheer, to cry, or to simply watch in silence. It is not every day that one sees power bend down to meet vulnerability. And yet, at that crossroads of life and leadership, a story unfolded that felt larger than the moment itself. The boy, still clutching the piece of bread he had been given, looked up at President Traoré with eyes that spoke louder than words. They were not only eyes of gratitude. They were eyes that asked a question. Will I matter tomorrow or only today? This is where the true test of leadership emerges. Many leaders can provide food for a day, but how many can plant hope for a lifetime? The crowd, though moved by the act of kindness, also carried this unspoken thought. Was this just a fleeting gesture, a scene for the cameras, or did it mean something deeper, something transformative? President Traoré understood the difference. He knew the weight of symbols, but he also knew that symbols must be backed by substance. So instead of simply returning to his car and driving away, he lingered. He spoke to the boy again, asking about where he slept, how he survived, and who, if anyone, looked after him. The child's answers were fragments of a broken world. Nights spent on sidewalks, mornings searching for scraps, and afternoons hoping strangers might show mercy. No family, no guardians, no safety net. Just survival. At that moment, Traoré did something unexpected. He turned toward the crowd and addressed them directly. His voice carried strength, yet it also carried sorrow. He spoke about the boy's story, but he didn't stop there. He reminded everyone listening that this one child was a reflection of thousands more, children scattered across the nation, each with their own untold stories of hunger, loneliness, and forgotten dreams. His words pierced through the air. A nation that does not care for its orphans is a nation that abandons its own future. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of reflection, of confrontation, of realization. Every person there knew he was right, and perhaps that was the most painful part. They had known it all along, but seeing it embodied in this one child made it impossible to ignore. Traoré then crouched down again, his hand gently resting on the boy's shoulder. In that gesture was both comfort and commitment. He told the child that his story would not end on the streets. He promised that from that day forward, he would not be invisible. And though promises are easy to make, something in the tone of his voice, firm yet tender, carried the weight of truth. The crowd erupted, not in cheers of politics, but in cries of shared humanity. Women wiped their eyes, men nodded solemnly, and children watched with a mix of awe and longing. But here lies the contrast, the powerful tension of the story. On one side, there was hope, a leader choosing compassion over indifference. On the other side, there was the sobering reality. One boy saved in that moment, but countless others still knocking on windows, still unheard. This duality is what makes the story both inspiring and haunting. For every orphan who captures the world's attention, there are many more whose knocks fade into silence. As the boy finished eating, his face softened. For perhaps the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt seen. He felt like a child again, not just a survivor. He even smiled. A small, fragile smile that carried the power to move mountains. Traore noticed it, and his own face lit up. Sometimes leadership is not about grand speeches or sweeping reforms. Sometimes it is about drawing out a single smile from a child who thought he had forgotten how to smile. The convoy, still paused, became more than a group of vehicles. It became a stage where the world witnessed the merging of pain and compassion. Soldiers who moments earlier had stood stiff in duty now found themselves glancing away to hide moist eyes. This was not the usual business of politics. This was something more sacred. But as touching as the moment was, life outside the circle of that car window continued. Vendors still called out their goods, though softer now. Mothers still pulled their children closer, as if to shield them from the reminder that life could be so cruel. And whispers spread quickly, carried from one street to another. Did you see what happened? Did you hear what Traore did? It was as if the city itself had paused to take note, before resuming its breath. Later, when asked about the encounter, some described it as destiny. Others called it a test, not only for the president but for the nation. For what is a leader if not someone tested by the cries of the forgotten? And what is a nation if not measured by how it treats its most vulnerable? These questions, sparked by one boy's knock, echoed far beyond Ouagadougou. They reached into villages, into homes, into the hearts of people who had never met the boy but felt as if they knew him. The story spread further still. Journalists wrote about it, elders discussed it in community gatherings, and children asked their parents why the boy had no one to care for him. The power of one story lies in its ability to awaken others. And that is exactly what was happening. The boy's knock was no longer just on a window. It was on the conscience of an entire people. For Traore, the moment was not about image, though the images captured would indeed circle the globe. It was about conviction. He believed that Africa's strength lay not in its wealth, nor even in its armies, but in its children. And if those children were abandoned, then everything else was built on sand. To him, the boy's knock was not a distraction from duty. It was the very essence of duty. As the convoy eventually prepared to move again, Traore made sure the boy was not left behind to fade back into the shadows. Arrangements were made, quietly but firmly, to ensure his care. This was not to be a story of temporary relief but of lasting change, at least for one child. And perhaps for others it would spark a movement. Yet the power of the story does not lie only in what happened that day. It lies in what it symbolizes for tomorrow. The image of a child pressing his hand to a car window and a leader pressing back with compassion is not just an image to be remembered. It is a challenge to every person who sees it. What will you do when someone knocks on your window? Will you ignore it, or will you stop and listen? That is why this moment, though it began with a whispering knock, thundered across hearts and history. It revealed both the fragility of life and the strength of kindness. And as we continue to follow this story, we will see how that single encounter transformed not only one orphan but the very definition of leadership itself. The convoy rolled forward once more, engines humming against the backdrop of the city. But for those who had witnessed the scene, the sound felt different now. Less like machinery, more like a reminder of movement, of progress, of possibility. The boy, once invisible to the world, now rode in the memory of every witness. His knock had transformed from a desperate cry into a powerful story of hope. President Traoré leaned back in his seat, the weight of the moment heavy yet necessary on his shoulders. He knew that acts like this, though small in the grand scheme of politics, carried ripples far wider than policies alone could create. Leadership was not measured only in laws or speeches but in moments of connection, when power pauses to kneel beside pain. And yet, the truth lingered. The story was both beautiful and haunting, for even as one boy was saved, countless others remained in shadows. Across Burkina Faso, and across Africa, there were children still searching for food, still pressing their hands against windows of strangers, still waiting for someone to notice them. The contrast was unavoidable. On one side stood the boy who had found compassion. On the other, a sea of children still unheard. It was this contrast that burned the scene into people's memories, a mixture of hope and ache, light and shadow. Days later, as word of the incident spread across villages and cities, something unexpected began to happen. Parents began telling their children the story, not as gossip, but as a lesson. "See," they said, "this is what a leader should do." Teachers shared it in classrooms. Preachers wove it into sermons. Elders recited it around fires. The boy had become more than a boy. He had become a symbol. And Traoré, through his act, had become more than a politician. He had become a reminder of humanity's responsibility. Journalists tried to capture the essence of it. They described the way the boy's tiny hand looked against the glass, the way his eyes carried both despair and courage, the way Traoré's response seemed instinctive rather than calculated. Some painted it as a turning point in African politics, a shift toward a new kind of leadership rooted not in power but in empathy. Others remained skeptical, wondering if the gesture would lead to lasting change or fade into history as another fleeting moment. But perhaps the true power of the story lay not in debates or articles, but in the quiet way it stirred ordinary hearts. People who had walked past orphans without looking twice now paused. Vendors who once shooed away hungry children now spared a piece of fruit. Families who had enough began sharing with those who had nothing. The boy's knock had become a call to conscience, and many answered it in small but meaningful ways. As for the boy himself, his life began to change. He was given shelter, food, and, most importantly, a sense of belonging. For a child who had lived invisible, being seen was the greatest gift of all. He began to laugh again, to play, to dream, and though the scars of his past would never vanish entirely, his future was no longer defined by loneliness. President Traoré, reflecting on the encounter, admitted that the boy had reminded him of something crucial. Leadership is not about being untouchable. It is about being reachable. To touch lives, one must allow oneself to be touched by their struggles. And in that moment at the car window, he had been touched deeply. He vowed, both to himself and his people, that his leadership would not shy away from the knocks of the vulnerable. The story, though simple, had carved itself into the larger narrative of Africa's fight for dignity. It was a reminder that revolutions are not only waged with weapons or rallies but also with gestures of compassion. That a leader's strength is not only shown in defiance against enemies but in tenderness toward the weak. And so, the story of one orphan boy and one president became more than a local event. It became a parable, a tale retold to inspire others far beyond the streets where it first happened. In it was a lesson for leaders everywhere. Power is fleeting, but compassion leaves a legacy. For those who still wonder why this story mattered, the answer lies not in politics, but in humanity. Because every society faces a choice each day, to hear the knocks on its windows or to ignore them. And every time someone chooses to listen, the world shifts, even if only a little, toward justice, toward mercy, toward hope. So, when an orphan knocked on his car window, President Traoré did more than give him food. He gave him recognition. He gave him dignity. He gave him a place in the story of his people. And through that single act, he reminded the world of a truth too often forgotten. Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with loud declarations, but with the quiet sound of a child's hand against glass. And as history records the struggles, the battles, and the victories of nations, perhaps it will also remember this, that one boy's knock changed not only his destiny but also the way an entire people saw themselves. that in the midst of politics and power, a leader chose humanity. And that choice, simple yet profound, is what truly defines greatness.